Hello, today we're going to look at two approaches to public education and decide which would be the better approach. Now, I did teach in the public school system from 1989 to 2012 when I retired. And we would talk as teachers, and I still talk to some of them, like Mark LaRose, and frequently about theories with education. You know, the best approaches, discipline and academic achievement, all of that. So, and I and he and other people, we would read about it, you know, different magazines, whatnot. And so we look at the history of public education in the United States. You know, you go back to the colonial days that there really wasn't any. There was education. If your parents could send you to school, they could afford it. Most people just learned at home. After the United States was formed and declared independence in 1776, and the Articles of Confederation were adopted in 1781 and then replaced in 1788 with the new Constitution, which today we call the Constitution, but making, as they said, a more perfect union. But regardless of all that, you look at how it developed in the New England states and then in the mid-Atlantic states up north of the Mason-Dixon line. You had more of a township format for local government and state government. So they tended to promote over time local communities supporting taxpayer-supported public schools. Now, when they started the Northwest Territories under the Articles of Confederation, 1780s, it was very carefully planned, and the idea was that each township that they divided it into, each little square, would have its own public school. In the South, it was different because you had the plantation economy, so those local governments were patterned mostly on county governments, okay, not local town governments. So in the county government and the domination of the plantation class, those people, they weren't really interested in public education. So they would send their kids to really France or Great Britain to go to school, get really good secondary education. They didn't really, there wasn't a big consideration that the working class, you know, the yeoman farmer or the city artisan, whatever, really needed much education that could be taught at home. Maybe they could learn to read and write, and that's all they needed. And then there was some influence or some call to modernize. You know, up in the North, you had the progressive movement early on, really with the Unitarian Church and Freemasons. We'll get back to them later, you know, Horace Mann and all of them, but to have this educated Protestant middle class, whatever. Okay, so that filtered down south, and the Whig Party was powerful up north and in the south. And the Whig Party came from Alexander Hamilton's idea of a national system, and he was opposed to Thomas Jefferson's idea of local government. So the original Federalist Party of Hamilton died out in the 18 teens. It didn't really die out. The idea stayed. So it just reformulated. Actually, what happened was the only party left in the 1820s was the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson. And the Whiggish idea, the Hamiltonian, have a strong national bank, Bank of the U.S., strong military, high tariffs, a national system of national railroads and later highways and canals and all of that, adopted by Henry Clay of Kentucky, kind of took up the mantle from Hamilton, and plus he represented the ideas of the North and the South being on a border, in a border state. But those ideas filtered what I'm saying is the Republican Party split into two factions. The Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, later Jacksonians, who were opposed to all the ideas I just stated pretty much. And then the National Republicans, the ideas of Hamilton and John Quincy Adams and all of them. So that party eventually became known as the Whig Party, which was represented in the North and the South. It didn't break apart until the 1850s, and really the 1850s, with the questions over popular sovereignty and the spread of the institution of slavery and all that, and this rivalry between the northern and southern states. And the northern Whigs became really the Republican Party of today. The southern, or the Democratic Republicans eventually just became known as the Democratic Party. But these ideas of the Whigs of having strong public schools did filter down to the South. So there was some efforts in southern states like Louisiana, for instance, where I am, to make public schools, to build public schools. There wasn't much success there because the Democratic Party was stronger, and the National Republicans weren't, and later the Whigs weren't so strong. Zachary Taylor was a Whig, though, from the South. But and even John C. Calhoun had Whiggish ideas early on, and then he turned away from that by the time he died, the last 10 years of his life. But the strength of the public school system was in the North, okay? Horace Mann, a Unitarian, they were so big into the progressive movements, or you could say revolutionary movements, building this new world in America. Later on, the next generation, your Theodore Roosevelt's and all of them. But he was so big into promoting public education, Horace Mann, and public school books. All right, this idea of national publication of school books. So, and he had a lot of him and the National Education Association, which was established in the 1850s. They had a lot of connection with publishing companies, so there was a big idea they wanted to promote school books. Okay, after the war on the South, or we could say the war between the states, there was a bigger push in the South to build public schools. So that's really when you could say in Louisiana and Florida and Georgia, they started to really earnestly build public schools, and they did. And by the 1900s, they had them in every town. And later in the 1920s, teens and 20s, they started building high schools in all the southern towns, which up north, they had been doing that for 100 years, right? Before that, in many cases. So the high school secondary education got to be big, and then this idea that college would be available to all students, and then the idea that led to the idea of course, we're not going to go into the whole history, that land grant colleges promoted by the Lincoln administration in 1862. And we had Louisiana State University, a land grant college, Texas A&M University. Interesting thing about that, real like an aside, in the southern states, they didn't want to have black schools. Really, I mean, maybe privately, that there was no real idea that the states wanted to have what they called then colored schools, But in the 1890s, the Republican administration said, because remember in the 1800s, the Republican Party was the Liberal Party, the old Whig Progressive Party. In the Southern, the Democratic Party, North or South, was the old Conservative Party, right? States' Rights Party. But they said, look, the Congress said, and the President, Harrison, look, if you're not going to have any state that refuses to have Negro schools, what they called them back then, or colored schools, you're not going to get any more money for land grant money. Oh no, all of a sudden all the states wanted to have, so they started building Alabama A&M University in Louisiana. They built Southern University, Grambling State University. So, but anyway, that's, I mean, the Republicans didn't really, for the most part, except for the radical Republicans, but just the regular old run-of-the-mill Republicans liberals, they didn't care if they had segregated schools, really, you know, as long as black students could get educated, right? So then they started building these all over the South. That's why you had that Delaware State University, another example in Dover, Delaware. But so there was this idea that students could go to school and get educated. Now, the second idea was that they should be compelled to go to school. So we have compulsory education, which was being heavily promoted in New England, you know, your Yankee states, and then it spread to the Atlantic states, the north, you know, then out to Minnesota, and then down to the South eventually. Now, states like Louisiana had compulsory education on the books, but it wasn't really enforced, okay? And even you could make the argument today it's not really enforced. I mean, we had students when I was teaching that didn't go to school, and they would subpoena the parents, and there would be some court proceedings. But I mean, nothing ever really happened. And the students knew. They knew if they didn't really want to go to, no one's going to go really look for the parents, and no one's going to prosecute anybody. So you could basically just grow up and never go to school. I'm talking about Louisiana. Now, other states like New York is probably much more activist about that. But here, like they used to say on ESPN, not so much. But so there was different varying levels of compulsory education, right? Okay, fine. And more students were educated. I remember when I went to school in the 1970s, we still had some teachers that only had high school education. I mean, it was later on, I guess in the 1950s, they passed a law in Louisiana that in order to teach school, you had to have a college bachelor's degree. But that wasn't retroactive. It was just say anybody from this point on, you have to have a bachelor's to teach school. But they had so many teachers left over from before that rule that I had some, or I knew, I had, I think one or two, and they had some left over that had only had a high school education. Many of them were good teachers, but that would not be the case today. But that was the rule. I mean, that was the case back then, just high school educated. Okay, but getting to the main point, if you acted up in school, you know, you're always going to have students that don't want to do, they don't like school, they don't want to do work. And then a lot of times school can be boring, you know, you want to be outside playing or whatever. But you have some that just won't comply. They used to call them uneducatable. They just don't want to do schoolwork. They hate it. So they would act up and cause trouble, and they would kick them out. They would just, you know, beat them, you know, whip them. We used to do that. Now, when I first started teaching, we had lessons on how to whip students. Talking about 1989, 1990. So I remember they were teaching me, you know, you hold your wrist straight with that paddle, and you hit them flush on the behind, but you hit them hard. You make them remember it. This is in fact the case. So we did do that until around the mid-90s. That was phased out in all the counties and parishes, I guess. But I know it went on until the mid-90s. So we would spank them. And you probably say, I bet that made you feel bad. No, it didn't really make me feel too bad. All right, made me feel better sometimes, but it did not hurt the students. But anyway, oh, that died out, right? So, but there was this idea that if you don't want to behave, you go home, you know, and they would suspend them. In some extreme cases, students maybe setting the gym on fire. You know, you get some like psychopathic students. You'd be expelled. You can't come to school. You're out. This was just the general approach. So it was a liberal arts approach in the sense that we want you to come to school and we want you to succeed. And here it is. It's free. It's offered to you. So most students, the vast majority, would go, and maybe some reluctantly, but they would do work and they would graduate. And some more able students would go to college. And many of them would graduate. But now we go to the 1950s. And the liberal movement becomes more of the, you know, it's so influenced by communism, right? Like Ronald Reagan said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. Let's look at Reagan for a minute. We're not going to talk about him much, but he's a good example. He was a liberal, Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal Democrat, right? Ronald Reagan. People think of him today as some great conservative. But this is not exactly, this is actually not the truth. It's not the truth. He was a liberal Democrat. because the Democratic Party was taken over by the progressives beginning in 1892. And the conservatives were pretty much gone by the 1940s, but they trickled on until the 60s in some cases, even the 80s in some cases, but not real conservatives. The last conservative Democratic president was Grover Cleveland, and he retired in 1897, okay? So, but Reagan, he didn't mind the New Deal, he didn't mind the minimum wage, Social Security, all these things. Now, you might say, well, I'm conservative, I don't like those ideas. And I would say that too, okay, because, you know, right-wing political solutions blog and all of that. But Reagan got this idea that the communist ideas were taking over the Democratic Party. That wasn't a liberal party. It was becoming a totalitarian, you know, Marxist, like Joseph Stalin party. And all this influence, right? Especially in the Screen Actors Guild and all of those. I mean, some of those were just like literally communist groups. So he was like, I got to get out of this. And so he joined the original liberal party, the Republican Party. And so many anti-communist liberals joined the Republican Party. Well, then what happened was that by abandoning the Democratic Party, that the Marxist, the Leninist, Marxist-Leninist, communist, socialists, etc., they slowly took over the whole party, you know. So basically the Democratic Party just became the Communist Party by the 1990s. So, and then you see these ideas filtering, right? Well, we go to integration or desegregation, not exactly the same thing, but in 1954 we have the Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, which caused so much uproar. And the idea was states can't, you know, this goes back to the 14th Amendment. Oh, you cannot segregate. Now, the original idea of the Supreme Court using the 14th Amendment, so you see, that's why I made an argument against the 14th Amendment before, because it's so vague, you can pretty much, you can make it say whatever you want it to say. And I think it was intentionally written vague like that, so that you could make it say whatever you wanted it to say. Such a useful tool and for totalitarian purposes. The original idea of the 14th Amendment from the 1890s was, well, you can't have inequality because it says that, but you could have segregation. You could have separate, but it has to be equal facilities. And that was the idea of the liberal, really kind of a liberal interpretation of the Supreme Court. Liberal in the context of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that was the practice. But then, you know, the more extreme liberals say, no, 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 we have to have mixed schools. And, you know, you look at some of the people that were promoting this, you know, like Gunnar Myrdal of Sweden, you know, that's flat out socialist, right? So in some ways it was like a slap against black students, because the whole idea of segregation of the liberal, I'm talking about the more extreme liberal view of segregation, was black students, and I've had people talk to me about this, even professors in college, but they brought up good points. They were saying, like, you know, the liberal mindset was this, and this goes back to the progressive era, because the progressive era was founded by white, New England, Protestant, Masonic liberals, who had a very dim view of minorities, I might add. Like, what's one of the fruits of progressivism today? Like, you know, abortion, birth control, and the great Margaret Sanger, great in the sense of impactful, not good. Well, her view of minorities was very bad. She did not want this country to be taken over, subsumed by human weeds, as she called them. She wanted it to be a strong white country. Okay, so in her eugenic viewpoint, and the progressives had this eugenics viewpoint, we want to create a strong, genetically powerful white paradise on earth, really what they're trying to do. They favored colonialism and all of this, so internationalism. So their idea really was that these blacks, you know, these Negroes or whatever they called them, you know, they didn't live around black people, you know. So where in the South you had segregated schools, but there was a lot of social interaction between white and black. I didn't say it was totally equal. There was interaction. But up north, the idea was these people cannot learn. They can't learn if they're not next to the magic Caucasoid, right? They just can't learn on their own. They're inferior. This is the viewpoint of the liberals. These black people are inferior. They cannot learn on their own. They have to be around the magic Caucasian. So we have to integrate them and have diversity, or what, like cohabitation within the classroom. Now, there was never this viewpoint that white students could not learn if they weren't around black students. Like you look at the whole history of civil rights movement, they're not saying, you don't see too much, how could these white students suffer like this if they're not around black? And there really wasn't much of a call among white parents that they needed to have their children in association with black students. There really wasn't a lot of call among black parents either. There was some by activist leaders. I think black parents, for the most part, just wanted to make sure that there was a equal per capita spending on students, things like that. And even you had progressive segregationists like Leander Perez in Louisiana, who was a most fanatical segregationist, but he couldn't stand mistreatment of black students. Like, you had these real racist segregationists who thought it was funny, like it was comical that the black students would get the old used textbooks that the white schools didn't want anymore. And Leander Perez couldn't stand those kind of things. He said, his basic attitude was, you people are, you're not just segregationists, you're just hateful. He always made sure that black students who had good academic abilities would go to public colleges and never pay a dime for the education. Now, of course, he would make sure they went to Southern University in Baton Rouge, Grambling State University in North Louisiana, or the new Southern University in New Orleans, which started in 1959. So that was his idea. Now, I'm not saying he was some great progressive mind that thought that white and black students were equal in intellect and all that. I mean, this guy, I'm just using it as an example of the different mindsets within that kind of world of segregation. Another example would be Earl Long. Definitely no integrationist by any real stretch of the imagination, but he had a kind heart and he wanted to help black students. And he did some reforms in Louisiana. Like he said, well, hell, white and black teachers should make the same amount of money. Why should black teachers earn less money? Things like that. But the radical integrationists, right, their viewpoint was, no, they have to go to school together. We can't just get rid of. Now, you had different levels of integration and desegregation too. Now, you have to understand, you just had moderate liberals that would say, well, like maybe a Ronald Reagan would be a good example. We're not going to have official segregation anymore. So if a black student lives down the street from a majority white school, they can go there. Or if a white student lives down the street from a black majority school, they can go there. Then you had the more aggressive integration to say, no, we got to have this true diversity. We do these madcap things like busing, which basically made the modern Republican Party. The Democrats said, let's cut our own throats and drive all the white mild liberals and quasi-conservatives out the party by let's promote busing, where we can ship students across town on a 45-minute bus ride so that they can go to this black school, and then the white student could be, or the black student could be shipped across town for 45 minutes so they can go to both ways now, going and coming back from school, so they can go to a school that's mostly white. Well, started having a lot of private schools built all over the country, but because white students almost in every case were not going to go on buses to a black neighborhood to go to school. That just did not happen. It basically never happened. But you did have a lot of black students shipped, like commodities across town to go to these white schools. So, but that did not result in integration. You know that as well as I do. It just resulted in less white schools, and basically, like for instance, Baton Rouge or New Orleans, good examples. You went from, in the 1950s, you had a lot of schools that were black and a lot of schools that were white. And then in the 60s and 70s, you had a lot of mixed schools. And then by the 90s, you had 100% black schools and white flight and all of this. So that was a failed project of the liberal, radical, socialist, whatever. Of course, you know what I'm saying, varying levels. Okay, now, so we go on. What about performance? The old progressive, the old liberal arts approach to the classical approach to education is that, and we can say liberal in the classic sense, that students should have equal opportunity to learn. Okay, I'll go along with that. I think most intelligent people would go along with that. Equal opportunity to learn. Now, of course, the Marxist is going to have a different idea of what equal opportunity means, right? But you can go to school and do your work, and you can get an education and do well in life and graduate, and good luck to you, and have a happy life and a good family. Okay, equal opportunity. And if you don't want to behave and cooperate, you go home. We're not going to let you come disrupt this school. But the Marxist approach of the last 50 years was we have to have equal outcomes. They don't care about the opportunity. It has to be equal outcomes. And if there's not equal outcomes, then apparently they make up terms like institutional racism. Okay, so they start looking at statistics over the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. I guess we're in the 2010s or 10s, or however you term that. Have all ethnic groups achieved at the same rate? Obviously, they have not. They never have. Black students tend to do much worse than white students on average. You got to go by average. You can never say, well, I know somebody. That's an inaccurate way of thinking. We don't look at exceptions. You look at the average. They have some heroin addicts that don't get fired from their jobs. Okay, so you wouldn't use a heroin addict who doesn't get fired from his job as an example of how heroin addicts perform in life. Okay, so the liberal Marxists start saying, well, how come black students score at the lowest level on achievement tests and have the lowest level of college entrance and lowest level of graduation, and Hispanic students do very poorly relative to white students and Asian students? It has to be institutional racism or some great conspiracy to prevent minorities from achievement. Now, the conservative, liberal, or the conservative viewpoint would be, well, maybe they don't try as hard. Maybe they don't care about school as much on average. How do you know it's some institutional conspiratorial plot by capitalists, right? So this big cultural struggle down to the decades since 1954 between the two groups. We know which group has taken control. It's the Marxist group. And so what has been put in place the last 50 years? The idea that all students must perform at the same rate. We know that's impossible. Well, or it seems unlikely at least. But so what do we have now? Well, we have these different ideas that they cannot be expelled. You see, students cannot be expelled or suspended. They have to have in-school suspension and alternative disciplinary approaches. You understand, for minority students. We never have the liberals saying that somehow white students have to be handled differently, because remember, in the liberal mindset, the white students are just regular people. They don't need special treatment. They can just go to school, and learn. They just behave. But the liberal Marxist mindset is these animal people, they don't want to act right. But it's probably because of some capitalist conspiracy. So we're gonna, and I saw this stuff, we're gonna have in-services to teach people how to approach the Negro, the color, the African-American student, whatever the term of the decade is. And I used to sit in these workshops and in-services. I didn't say a lot. I would just think, these people are crazy, They're so racist, they don't even know it. And they would say, like, well, now in my teaching, I would just talk to every student like a normal human being, right? I didn't have the black student approach or the white student approach. I just had the, human being approach. It usually worked very well. But the liberal mindset, well, the black student, whatever they would say, like they take offense to things easier. The black student, they don't like when you turn your head a certain way against them. They're very easily offended. Like, I'm thinking, what are these, like, special, like, little animal people? Like, they're like special creatures. They can't think like a normal person. What's wrong with these people? These people are crazy. And I would just listen. I would think, these people went to college and they have these in-services today. But they never have it like how you got to treat Asian students. Oh no, the Chinese, they just learn. They'll all make straight A's, they're smart. But these Hispanic students, they have to be treated a certain way. You don't want to offend them. They're so easily offended. Like, they can't think like a regular human. And this is really the approach. It's so insulting, to the minority student, because they're basically saying, well, you're not a real human. So we have to placate you in all these ways. And you can see that in the criminal justice system, right? Like if there's a shooting or something, go talk to those people in this soothing way, because they're so liable to riot. You can't talk to them like a regular person. And they might even teach the sheriff's department, talk to them in a sing-song way. They like sing-song, call and response. Go down there and do call and response. They loves that. They loves call and response. And these liberal people, they don't even, it's like, wow, you're the most racist people in the world. You can't talk to people like a regular human. But that wasn't a conservative viewpoint. The conservative viewpoint was, well, maybe everybody won't perform the same way. It's a shame, but that's the reality in the world. We're giving them equal opportunity. We don't worry about the outcomes. The outcomes are irrelevant. This is the conservative, liberal, or the conservative viewpoint. The outcomes is irrelevant. Maybe white students will score at this level, and black students will score at this level, and Hispanic students, because we're not obsessed maybe so much with racial outcomes like the liberal Marxists are. And we don't need to bus people across town. Just let people go. And remember, in the early 90s, before the Republican Party became so liberal controlled, they would even talk about neighborhood schools. We need to go back to neighborhood schools and stop busing people. And they were terrified to say that today. Maybe Donald Trump would say, all the rest would be scared to say it. They might call me a racist. Look, if the communists call you a racist, you should take that as an honor, because you're probably doing something right. Now look at the deterioration of the public schools over the last 50 years. I mean, the stuff I saw, and I'm sure if you teach in the Bronx, it's much worse. Just psychopathic students running the hallways. They can't put them out. And the schools cannot expel these students. They have to let them come to school. No matter how deranged they are. We have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, which began federal funding of the schools. And I'd like you to show me in the Constitution where it says Congress shall give money to states for public schools. You won't be able to find that. And then we have the public law, what is it, 94142, the Special Education Law of 1973-74. I think it went into effect in 74, signed by Nixon, I might add. But which brought in all this special education. Now you're thinking in your mind, well, we have to help students in wheelchairs. Look, most special education in the schools today is students who are illiterate, although they could learn to read. And I could do a discussion about whole word approach versus phonics. Schools generally don't teach phonics anymore. And that's why you have so many students that can't read. I used to tell the principals that. They would get angry though. They'd say, what could we do to improve the schools? What program could we start? And I would say, well, the main thing you could do that wouldn't cost any money, you could just start teaching them how to read properly. Oh, they would get angry. Because most people could learn how to read if they're taught correctly. Most schools teach students how to read incorrectly. They teach them whole word, as though you're going to memorize every word in the world, instead of simply teaching them how to sound out letters, how to pronounce letters. If you can learn to pronounce letters, you can read anything. I do beer reviews, and I watch some other people do beer reviews, and they can't read. These are adults. Cannot read. I mean, maybe they could read Stop and Big Mac, but they can't actually read. They'll read the label or they'll read a website, and they can't read. They're illiterate. I'm not blaming them per se. Really, they probably weren't taught how to read. And you could take a person that's illiterate or functionally illiterate, and you can teach them how to read. I've told students that. I said, I can teach you how to, if I had time, I could teach you how to read. I even told the principal, take away one of my social studies classes and give me a class of students, and I guarantee every one of them, unless they're really disabled, and that's not that common, I could teach them how to read. Oh, they didn't want to hear that. So we have a lot of black minorities, a lot of black students, of course, a lot of white, but really, it's really bad in the black community. They cannot read. And if you can't read, what are you going to do in school? How are you going to function in school? You can't. Of course, you're going to act up. You can't. But these schools, they show videos. They do all kind of interactive, cooperative education. And I used to watch a lot. I watch, I say, they're not really doing any work. They're not really learning anything. They don't know any facts. They don't know anything. They learn how to cooperate. Well, a lot of times big fights would break out. Maybe they'd shank somebody with a pencil or a big one of those big stiff combs, you know what I'm talking about? A pick. I don't know how cooperative it was, but there's no real scholarship. And schools love to use sloganeering, you know, only scholars enter here, we will make it. They do this all over. You go to the worst public school in the country, you know, where they have 2 or 3 murders a year. And they'll have slogans everywhere. Oh, you can make it. And they'll have some motivational speaker who usually is horrible and gives bad advice and makes incoherent speeches, I find, or some rap music. I'm not against rap music, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's like, what is this about? And but anyway, all this goes on, and you have this low graduation rate. Now they manufacture graduation rates, as you know. The students really don't really earn it, you know. So and then they go to college, they can't do work. You know, they can't do real college work. So that's a serious problem in education. This idea by the liberal Marxists that different minority groups are inferior, and that there's some capitalist white conspiracy to keep them down, which is a total lie. They don't discipline the students today, so they run wild in school. I mean, run wild, run out of control. You know that, I know that, the American people know that, like Bob Dole used to say. They can't put them out. I mean, this is the viewpoint of the federal government, the administration today, the current presidential administration, Department of Justice, if you want to call it justice. They'll go to a school system and say, you have a disproportionate number of black students that are being disciplined, whatever that is. Today it's probably in-school suspension or whatever they call it. They have different euphemisms for it. And why is that? You know, but the Marxists, they won't say, I mean, they'll say it to each other at home maybe, but they won't say, well, maybe that, you know, the conservatives would just say, well, maybe that group of people act up more. Maybe they don't behave. Like Walter Williams was a black conservative activist. He'll say, well, they don't act right. That group of students, on average, has much worse behavior because of the system that expects them to act like animals. So when you expect people to have no sort of self-control, then they will go, you know, like Walter Williams said, black students and to a large extent in America are hostile towards education. It's very hard to teach people who are hostile. You know, it's hard to teach people that don't want to learn. And so it's sad. It could be rescued. Okay, this situation, it'll take many decades to reverse it, but we have to get rid of we have to get these progressive Marxist, Leninist, communists, of all levels out of power. We have to bring in conservative, right thinking in meaning correct thinking and politically right thinking people in office. Who are saying, no, you don't have to be shipped across town on a bus 45 minutes so that we can have this pie in sky diversity. And they'll say diversity makes us stronger. They never really tell us how that or why that's true. Japan is not diverse, but they're strong. It's like all Japanese people, and they all learn. They don't have this great desire that they need to sit next to Filipino or Peruvians to learn. But the conservative viewpoint is that, no, we're going to have tough. We're not talking about beating people or I'm not even advocating. I don't want the other people spanking my kids or this tough. We're gonna be like the guy with the megaphone screaming at people and Stand By Me. We don't need all that. We need good, solid education. Here it is. It's offered to you. You can come to school and behave. You can do the work. We're going to teach phonics. We're going to teach you how to read. We're going to teach you all these good liberal arts, science, math, English, poetry, etc. If you don't want to comply, you know, unfortunately, you won't be able to come to school here. And then a lot of people say, yeah, but they'll run the streets and go wild. Well, that's a law enforcement issue. You know, school is not a holding cell for psychopaths. I mean, it is today, but it should not be. Okay, so if you don't want to act right at school, you have to stay home. And if there's a disproportionate, now, You know, at first, there will be a disproportionate number of Black and Hispanic students, less Hispanic, but Black percentage-wise, that will be sent home, and they'll be suspended or whatever. And then the Marxists will say, oh, it's a capitalist white conspiracy. You just have to ignore that. It's not racism. It's just that you have to behave. You have to behave. And that's not racist to say people have to behave. It's intelligent to say that. White people have to behave. Black people have to behave. Oriental people, that's an old term that people feel is gauche to say today, have to behave. Everybody has to behave. All education matters. All lives matter. Now, if you want to be violent at school, you cannot come back. Now, we have to be very serious about violence at school. We have people that attack other, we have students that attack other students, attack teachers. These people cannot be at school. Maybe they can be in a prison far, far away, away from society. They don't belong in society. We don't want them in society. You know, in the right, we in the right-wing world, we have a very brutal, if you want to say, I would rather use a word like exuberant or decisive attitude towards violent crime. You know, our viewpoint, our outlook about violent crime is very negative. We certainly are not going to tolerate having it at school. Now, these liberals do, you know, these are careerists. Many of these people are careerists. They see it, but they'll talk in public like it doesn't go on. I mean, I used to watch these school officials lie. Now, there was one thing they could do. They may not have been competent leaders. They weren't particularly, most of these guys, administrators, weren't particularly smart. And they didn't care too much about students, although they would feign an attitude of caring. But one thing they could do, these careerists, they could lie. They could lie. I mean, these people were like past masters of lying to the media. And they would present these wonderful attitudes of how great the school is, and I would be sitting behind them thinking, you damnable liar, you know what goes on here. But I was no careerist, and I had no desire to be some administrator or run a department or, you know, be the director of curriculum or any of those jobs. And I'm not saying every administrator is a corrupt careerist liar. I'm just saying most of them are. It seems to be, and they're all members of the NEA, you know, most of them the National Educational Association. I was a member of that, I have to confess. I didn't know. I started teaching and somebody came up to me and said, you're a member of the union? I said, no, I don't think I can afford that. The dues seemed rather high. Oh, well, you can't afford, you know, like the mafia, you know, you can't afford not to join. I'm thinking, what? So I joined, you know, better be safe than sorry, but I remember I read the nobody ever does this, but I read the program, I read the platform of the NEA, I read their brochure. They would give it, most people would throw it in the trash. I'm reading this. We had our convention in San Diego, 1993, and I'm reading it, and I said, this is all like what the Socialist Workers Party advocates for. So I went to my union representative, I said, do you ever read these things? Oh yeah, what about it? I said, I cannot in good conscience be a member of a communist organization. I want to quit. I want to quit. Oh no, you joined up. You can't end your membership until June. I said, well, the second that my membership can be invalidated, I'm out. You sure you want to go without the teacher's insurance? I said, yes. If I get sued, you know, and you have these parents that cruise around praying that their child could be hurt at school, so they can get that magic lawsuit against the school. Just, you know, the same people that drive around hoping to get hit by 18-wheelers so they can call, I'm calling Meyer Barkowski. He got my cousin $250,000. I'm calling Jacob Greenberg. He got my uncle $600,000. You see him on TV all the time. But I said, no, I'm not giving money to these communists. And then I joined the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Teachers. I said, maybe they're not as bad, you know. And then I remember I'm reading their stuff, and I say, this stuff's no good. It's all about Bill Clinton, and who wasn't Marxist enough for them, you know, but they generally supported him. And I remember Sandra Feldman made a speech. We must not look at free market solutions. to our educational problems. And I said, now I will quit this group. And I joined the Association of Professional Educators of Louisiana, APEL. And they weren't really a political group. They just gave you insurance in case some person sued you. I never had that problem because God bless me. And I generally was not confrontational with students. You learn these things as you teach. Like, I would watch and I would say, you know, I said this to Mark, the guy I was talking about earlier, Mark LaRose. I said, you know, half the problems we have at this school are caused by shrieking middle-aged women. You know, they can't just ask us, you know, this is a problem in education. They can't just ask them, you know, where's your ID, right? As a rule, you have to wear an ID. That makes sense, right? You have to wear an ID to school because you could be a trespasser on campus and endanger the student body. You don't have to have an ID to vote for some reason. Could be an imposter, and you can vote without an ID, and just somehow you don't have to prove that you're who you say you are. But these shrieking middle-aged women would, where's your ID? And screaming in their face, and the students would react and scream back, and it would turn into this big confrontation. And that was in fact a big problem. We don't need to be confronting students. We don't need to be yelling at students, talking ugly to them, downgrading them, screaming at them, or anything like that. They have a right to be treated with respect, white or black, male or female. We don't need to placate students and talk down to them, you know, like, oh, hello, you little minority student. That's an insult, and people are not going to react the right way. And I didn't do it. And usually when I run across the students I taught, they're like, hey, how's it going? You know, we had a pretty good rapport. So we need to get rid of the psychopathic students, and every school's got them. They should not be at school. I don't care what so-called disability they claim to have. That's usually bunk. It's a lie. But they want that SSI check. Yeah, hundreds of dollars a month to treat their disability. Actually, to buy fancy, expensive tennis shoes. But, we've got to get rid of this busing, this idea that we need to have diversity, and this fantasy idea. I'm not saying we need to have strong discipline in school. You see, you're taking it the wrong way. I'm saying we need to have good discipline in school. If you don't want to behave, you don't go there. You don't have to come to school. We don't want you there. You're unwelcome. You don't have to say it in an ugly way. You know, we appreciate you. You're a human being. You deserve respect, but you're not coming to this school anywhere in this state because, you know, unfortunately, you're a psychopath. That's the way it goes. Sorry. So we do want excellence in education. We want a liberal arts approach. We want everybody to have the opportunity to go to school and learn. And to end this, we don't believe in federal interference in public schools in any of the states. We don't want we don't want the federal government telling states how they have to construct or to conduct public education within their state. So no, we do not support all the federal interference within the public schools in the 50 states since 1954. Absolutely, we do not support that. Oh no, that's for each state to decide. So yes, we stand for states' rights. You know, we are strident supporters of states' rights. Most certainly. Now, of course, the U.S. government can tell public schools what to do within territories because those are under the jurisdiction of the U.S. government. Washington, D.C., Guam, American Samoa. Not to say that they couldn't allow them to have internal self-government in public education. We're not saying that either. So anyway, I would be interested to see what people say. We can't go on forever. I wish these kind of discussions would be held in public schools and the administration of state governments. They usually aren't. It's a very politically correct approach toward public education within the states. And of course, we know what politically correct means. It means communist. And this is true, in fact, because this is an old term. I have an old book from 1958 called Masters of Deceit, what the communist bosses are doing to bring America to her knees. And they use the term politically correct. And politically correct is a term that means anything that promotes communism would be considered politically correct. And anything that would fight against communism would be considered politically incorrect. So that's where that word comes from. The roots are in the Marxist-Leninist worldview. So thank you once again, and have a nice day.